Hi, everybody. I'm Erika Sanzi, the Director of Outreach here at Parents Defending Education, and thank you so much for joining us. So, tonight we're going to talk about a very important and timely topic that has to do with school budgets and the massive disruption that is headed our way, unfortunately, often referred to as the fiscal cliff. And the reason that we're going to see such an unprecedented budget situation starting in the next school year really is a result of several factors. One major one being that the COVID relief money, also known as ESSER funds, ESSER, is coming to an expected but abrupt end. And that's going to mean that school districts are really going to have to right size their budgets um, due to the fact that they're going to have far less money than they've had for the past few years. Layering on top of that, the declining student enrollment and also districts that made decisions to spend that ESSER money on expenses that were not just one-time expenses, and we have a bit of a perfect storm. So today's episode is going to be different than ones that we've had in the past. Rather than interview an expert on this subject, largely because the person that we want is so busy informing the world about what's coming, instead, we're going to take advantage of some of the webinars and videos that she and her staff have made and help you guys understand what's going on that way. And then my colleague, Marissa Fallon, is going to join us for the second half, and she and I are going to talk a little bit about what this means for school districts and communities and parents, and also ways that people can have their voices heard since these budget hearings are starting, actually have started or are happening now. Okay, so the first question is, what is ESSER and what is the fiscal cliff? And again, it's ESSER. And so we decided to, again, bring you information that's been collected by the smartest people on this topic. So Marguerite Rosa and her team at the Edunomics Lab at Georgetown University have been working tirelessly on this topic, crunching numbers, looking at districts all over the country, and then trying to bring that information to people so that communities, district leaders, elected officials, and people will understand what is really coming. We're going to show you a clip now of one of their presentations that's talking about what's been going on and also what is to come. But before we roll the clip, I do just want to again reiterate, when you hear the word ESSER, that really refers to COVID relief funds, also sort of commonly and informally known as COVID money. All right, let's roll that clip.
The school finance landscape is shifting rapidly, and there's fiscal shocks coming that we haven't ever seen before. Obviously, it's going to be critical that leaders navigate this. So what we did was we essentially went through and dug into the numbers in 4 states to get a sense of how big is the shock and what's coming down the pike. So just a lot of people have seen this. We put it up at the front just in case anybody hasn't, but the 4 shocks that are coming our way are going to have a pretty big impact starting with the 24-25 school years. So right now we're in a positive shock situation. Last year was even more positive, but it's starting to ease off. You're already starting to hear districts, sort of see what's changing. In 24-25, we're in a negative shock, meaning that districts are spending less than they would expect in a normal year. 25-26 is still negative, but not as much. So we've been calling 24-25 the bloodletting. That language is stuck, even though it's a little gory, and I apologize for that. But the idea was really to get people's attention to when the fiscal cliff is really going to take effect.
Okay, and so as you can see from the graphs that she put up, schools are about to go back to their pre-COVID funding levels. And again, Marguerite uses the word bloodletting because we really are talking about numbers that we've never seen before. And districts, and when they try to right size these budgets, they're going to be facing the need to make massive, painful cuts. Okay, and I think it's also fair to say most of the public remains totally unaware of this. We are not hearing about this, on the nightly news or on cable news. It is not headlines front and center. And so we have this massive disruption headed towards K-12 districts all over the country. And yet it still seems like awareness on this is very low. So again, we're so grateful to Marguerite Rosa and her team. And then we're just trying to do our part to, again, begin to spread the word and help people understand that now is the time to be attending budget hearings or speaking up in your districts, again, before you see some things that you care deeply about on the chopping block. Okay, for our next clip, we're going to look at a report that's specifically from Connecticut, just to use that again as an example of what's coming and to look at some real numbers. This is going to, again, help demonstrate why this fiscal cliff is going to be so brutal. So let's roll that second clip.
In Connecticut, we're anticipating a 3% fiscal cliff for most districts. And I'll give you a little bit of an explanation of that. This is the fiscal cliff caused by ESSER. So there's the cliff caused by different pieces, but this is really the impact of ESSER. So there's been some state increases, but they're not enough to offset the cliff and absorb all of the inflationary raises in Connecticut. Connecticut is increasing its K-12 funding by $200 million, but that's about a 7% increase in total state revenues for schools. So that's not enough quite it's blunting the cliff, but not enough to completely offset it. We are also still seeing that Connecticut students are not back on track academically. Recent scores show some modest recovery in math, but some further declines in reading. So those are some additional pressures. Connecticut districts have spent ESSER on pace with the national average, although it varies widely across districts. Some of them, we're not sure completely what's going on, but they've spent it all, and some of them really have spent very little. So a lot of districts are out of that money already, and so we've been tracking that. I'll explain why in a minute. The higher poverty districts tend to have deeper cliffs. And this is nationwide a trend. While these districts will benefit more from the state increases in Connecticut, they also receive more ESSER and will have more remaining. So the issue in Connecticut really is that the higher poverty districts are the ones we're watching. So in Connecticut, and we've been hearing this from around the country, people are starting to, how can I shore up my reserves to blunt the cliff? Well, in Connecticut districts, they generally don't carry reserves. 2% can be reserved in a town account, but that's not really an option for Connecticut districts. And this is maybe the biggest pressure for the long run, is statewide enrollment is down 7%, while staffing has grown, as it has in many places over the last decades. We'll talk about that in a minute. Many districts are going to struggle to afford the larger FTE counts once ESSER ends.
Okay, so when we hear a 3% reduction, which is what they're talking about in Connecticut, again, like if we're thinking 3% on a small amount, then it doesn't seem like it's that bad. But when you're talking about school budgets for districts and for states, this is a lot of money. And in some places, they really are talking about, cuts in the tens of millions, potentially more. And the other piece is that we also know that students are not back on track academically. So then the question becomes, if we've made these hires to help students get back on track academically, well, it hasn't worked, and we probably can't even afford to keep those people anymore. So again, it's like a massive, massive mess. So the other piece of this is that she's mentioned school enrollment being down. This is also a national trend. Part of it is just declining birth rates. Part of it is that when schools were closed for so long during COVID, so many families looked for other options and haven't come back to their districts. So again, you have enrollment decreases. I know that in some places, they're literally talking about having lost 25% of their student population over the past decade. So as the enrollment numbers go down, and remember, right, dollars attached to students. So, there's money attached to each child that attends a public school, both state and federal dollars, and local dollars too, actually. And so when your enrollment goes down, that's less money coming into the school district. And then on top of that, because they did so much hiring, in school districts before the pandemic, and then certainly during and after, they have this problem of having increasing staff while they have decreasing student population, which again brings us back to why we have this perfect storm. Okay, for the last clip, we're going to show how schools, oh, well, I just said what we're going to show. So basically now you're going to actually see what this looks like with fewer staff, I'm sorry, with more staff and fewer students, and what that's going to mean. Also, in the last clip, you heard Marguerite say the FTE, and you're probably going to hear her say that again in the next one. And FTE just refers to full-time employees. Okay, let's go with video clip 3.
In Connecticut, some staffing increases steadily over the last several years, some of this fueled by ESSER funds. And at the same time, kind of a steady decline in enrollment. You could see that a larger drop during the pandemic, but we're not seeing a bounce back. So districts have effectively added over 4,000 more FTE since 2019, while they have simultaneously lost some students. And some of that makes sense, right? Districts had money, they were hiring people to try to help their students get back on track. Where they had excess capacity, that was maybe not the best time to eliminate that excess capacity. But this is the challenge going forward. It's not necessarily sustainable. We're imagining that districts will use a mix of attrition and some layoffs to eliminate that excess capacity. And attrition is a mixed bag, right? Because sometimes you don't get the right people to leave, right? So you maybe have too many electives teachers and you've lost really all your math and science teachers. So attrition is never even. And sometimes attrition lands in our highest poverty schools. And so you see a lot more turnover there and unfilled positions. So where we're using attrition, we got to be paying attention to whether or not that is a deliberate strategy or not.
Okay, so there Marguerite again shows you the actual numbers. And again, she's talking about Connecticut, but this is a national trend. The other thing is that she's referring to, layoffs. And we've already seen some districts announce some numbers of layoffs, and these numbers are very, very big. So again, very painful decisions for districts as they approach and prepare for this fiscal cliff. One thing that's important to know too is, and she mentions in that, is that, if you have people just leaving, you never know if you're going to have the people that would be best to leave in terms of student learning. But the other problem is that in many places, they still have what's called last in, first out. And that refers to agreements and union contracts that mean that the first people to be let go, if there are layoffs, have to be the newest teachers. And the problem with that is that it does not take into account teacher quality, teacher performance at all. So again, that's just something to keep in mind. Lastly, we know that school districts have spent a ton of money in recent years on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, initiatives, and staff. They often have not just one person, but whole teams. And again, they're paid usually much more than teachers are paid. So that's a big budget item. And they also have spent a lot of money on social emotional learning programs. So, and that has happened, unfortunately, at the expense of math and reading and science and civics. So one way that parents and members of the community can have their voices heard is to find out, how much are you spending on these initiatives? And also, what are your plans as you right size the budget? Who is staying and who is going, and then to sound the alarm if you see that, again, they're going to be maintaining these big diversity, equity, inclusion programs and staff and social emotional learning programs and contracts that go along with that, versus focusing on the very fundamental basics like math and reading, where we know that student performance has absolutely plummeted. Okay, so now we're going to bring in my good pal and colleague, Marissa Fallon.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. And Marissa actually had sent me a quick note in the beginning of the video, which I didn't see, but now that I'm seeing it, I am going to take her suggestion. And her suggestion was that we should probably define for people what ESSER stands for. Again, ESSER. And so, sorry to be telling you so late in the game here, but it is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief. That's what it stands for. Again, coming out of Washington, they always have like an acronym to go with these long-winded titles. But again, Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief is what ESSER is. And then, sort of like normal people like us really refer to it as COVID money or COVID relief funds. Okay, so now we're on the subject of what can parents do? And obviously the question everyone's going to be asking after this hearing this depressing news, possibly for the first time, is what can we do about this? So Marissa, what can we do about this?
Well, first of all, one of the most important things that we can do, I have a couple different categories here that I'll go through quickly, but one of, if not the most important thing that parents can do is to educate yourself about what is going on and about the budget process in your school division. We saw some great videos about what is happening with these funds and how these funds are drying up. You can take that information and you can ask a lot of those questions surrounding the topics that Marguerite addressed to your own school. So the first thing you want to do is educate yourself. You're starting to do that now. So good job. Thank you for watching the video. The next thing we want you to do is share the video with other parents because they may not know about us. So if you can share this, then they can educate themselves. Another thing that's really important is the timeline, the ESSER timeline, and when your budget meetings are being held in your district. So that's going to include ESSER funds and all of the money that your school is spending. So you can see we have a slide which shows you how quickly things are moving, and we're already in March. So now's the time to get involved. Now's the time to find out when and where your budget committee is meeting. Make sure you get yourself to those meetings, or if you can't go to the meetings, sometimes they have them over Zoom. If they're not over Zoom, sometimes you can read the meeting minutes afterwards. There are usually a few parents in every district who write meeting summaries. So try to find out who that parent is, and you can read the meeting summary if you can't attend the meeting in person. Those meetings will show you where the district is planning on spending the money. You often have opportunities to ask questions. Sometimes you have to submit written questions, but it gives you an opportunity to ask questions. So you want to educate yourself. You want to share this video with other people. You want to familiarize yourself with your district's timeline. And at Parents Defending Education, with talking with parents all around the country, we and parents are very, very concerned about the learning loss that's happening in our schools. So one thing you really want to look at when you're diving into these budgets, which can be very confusing, as Erika touched on, is where is this money going? It's a finite resource, how much money these districts have. So as we've seen staffing numbers go through the roof and we're seeing enrollment numbers plummeting, schools in the past several years have kind of shifted where they're spending their money. As Erika touched on, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, those departments are exploding at districts all across the country. And a lot of money is going to pretty high salaries for people in those positions. The other place we're seeing a ton of money being spent is on social and emotional learning, surveys, programming, classroom activities, instruction. A lot of school districts are signing contracts with outside consultants. So that's a really interesting place to see where the money is being spent, because to help with the learning loss, we really want those finite resources to be spent on maybe hiring a reading specialist, maybe having an after-school reading program, maybe having extra time early in the morning or after school for students to work on math, maybe having an opportunity to do small math work groups, things like that. So you really want to think critically when you look at these budgets about what buckets, is the money going into. And another thing that I'll say about that is you're not alone. Don't feel like you're alone in having to do that. We always recommend parents work together. So work together with other parents that who have other similar questions about what's going on with the budget, and kind of share the work. And everybody looks at things differently, especially when it comes to complicated budgets. So it's helpful to have other people to talk to about what you're reading, because a lot of parents are not familiar with reading these very complicated budgets.
like, I am not familiar with reading these very complicated budgets because they are very confusing and incredibly intimidating. So the other thing that I would say too is if you pull up the budget on your district website and all of it, and you realize, oh my gosh, this is like so many pages, it's all just line items. I don't know what I'm looking at. Don't feel bad that you feel totally intimidated and clueless. That's the normal feeling to have. But there are always people within a community who know how to look at budgets. And so one of the things is that, among your sort of parent pals, you likely do know someone who looks at that kind of stuff all the time and isn't going to want to go crawl back under the covers when they pull it up. And so they can be really, really helpful. The other thing I would say too is that as much as Marissa's right, and this is what I said earlier too, like getting rid of programs that are unnecessary, and I would argue even programs in the DEI sort of SEL world that I think are bad for students and for school communities. But at the end of the day, the biggest budget item is their staffing. And so escaping layoffs is going to be virtually impossible because just the salaries and the compensation just take up such a huge chunk of the budget, especially because districts have so many obligations to retirees that they can't really touch. So we're not saying, oh, if you get rid of, DEI, you'll be able to save all the teachers. Like that's definitely not going to be the case because a lot of places are looking at school closures, massive layoffs, larger class sizes, and reductions in programs, especially programs that are, extracurricular, so to speak.
Yeah. And I think just adding on to that, I think one thing we want to be mindful of is I think as we move through this process and as these funds are, I don't want to say pulled back, but just evaporate, right? Because they were, as Erika stated, it's the elementary and secondary school emergency relief that ESSER was. And a lot of schools, which Erika touched on, have hired and spent money and committed long-term. I mean, when you hire teachers, there's a lot that goes into hiring a teacher, getting them onboarded, everything HR behind the scenes. There's a lot that goes into hiring teachers. So it's not something that you can do for 6 months, right? Or you can do for a year. I mean, these schools have made pretty major commitments when they've hired so many teachers. And with the enrollment going down, one thing I think is going to be really interesting to hear about, and Erika, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, is we hear this all the time. We're going to be hearing it even more going forward. And I think there's really going to be a push for the mantra that we've always heard, fully fund schools in the context of the ESSER money evaporating. So I think a big talking point that's going to be coming out from unions and et cetera is we need to fully fund schools without really people understanding that for the past 3 years, there's been kind of an artificial infusion of money into schools. And some school districts were not super responsible with how they spent that money. Some were better than others. But I think we are going to hear a lot about, the need to fully fund schools as this money evaporates.
Of course we are, because the thing is that districts, they get used to what they have and they're used to that never decreasing. It only increases. And the other problem is this was really meant, I mean, people think back, this was about air filters. This was about clean, air. This was about making it so kids could safely go to school.
Right.
Now, in the district's defense, many of them were not prepared for this infusion of money. They didn't really have a way to spend it. But because there was a deadline that they had to spend it, they started thinking, oh my gosh, we don't even know what to do with this money. And that's why we saw bonuses, which honestly, a bonus is better than something like, promising cost of living adjustments, because the bonus is a one-time thing. So even if people were mad about people getting bonuses, at least it doesn't, you're not paying it forever. The problem are the places especially that use one-time funds for things that are going to cost them something in perpetuity. They can't roll it back. And that's, again, I mean, hiring employees is one of those things, but certainly if you give raises or if you
Yep.
give increases in COLAs, well, now you can't roll that back, even though I suspect many district officials are wishing that they could. I mean, and again, like we saw lots of sort of crazy wasteful spending with this money. There were some places I think they built like big football stadiums.
Yep.
And of course, there's 1,000 reasons to criticize that. But the one thing that's probably not a problem with it is it was like a one-time thing. It wasn't, we're going to build a football stadium every year for the next 50 years. But that's not me saying a football stadium was the right thing to do.
Right.
I'm just pointing out that, again, it is different than promising raises. Okay. So, about parents getting involved, I guess the question is like, and you touched on this a little bit, but I think you have more thoughts on basically how can parents learn more, not just parents too, I mean the public in general, but learn more about what their district plans to do. Again, knowing that that graphic that we saw a minute ago basically said that by the end of May, it's too late. The budget is going, I mean, again, unless something we're unaware of is going to happen, like they're planning on having these budgets set in 2 months.
Right.
Less than 2 months.
And some districts are further along than others in their putting out their advertised budgets, right? That's when you really want to get involved, is when you see the advertised budget, because it's kind of, if you will, like a draft budget, right? So that's the best opportunity for input. The further along you go, the further you get to May. If you see the slide that we have up on the screen underneath May 2024, you see the last slide in red, too late to affect budget. So if you want to have input on the budget, like the time is now. So the best ways that you can have the biggest impact, and I guess best understanding as well about what's going on, is to ask a lot of questions. We have a great list of questions on defendinged.org on our website. You see the link there, defendinged.org /fiscal cliff. You can go there and you can see, I think we have about 10 questions there about things that you can ask your district. And when I say ask your district, I mean, if you have a relationship with a school board member, ask that school board member. If you have a relationship with an assistant superintendent, reach out to that person. I mean, just sending one email to the superintendent of your district, especially if you have a big district, you're probably not really going to get too far. So, think a little bit creatively about how to navigate that whole process of who to ask questions to, because just as important as what you're asking is who you're asking it of, so that you get an answer. Because, and you'll find in everyone's districts, we all know, right? There's some administrators and staff who are more responsive to these types of inquiries, and there's some people who are not. So what you want to really do is kind of zero in on the people who are going to be the most helpful and who really want to share this information. And again, talk amongst other parents, because you'll find out who's extremely helpful. So go to our website and pull up that list of questions, and that'll get you started and that'll get you thinking. So that's something that you really want to do. I would say I would start with really basic questions, because I do not have an economics or an accounting background. If I had to read the budget myself right now, I can't even imagine. I think if Erika and I got together to read a budget, I'm not sure how far we would get with it at all. I think we'd probably abandon the mission. So start really, really basic. What was the total budget for last year? What is the budget looking like for this year? Are there any big category shifts? Where is the budget posted, right? First of all, you've got to find the budget. If you're going to attempt to look at the budget, you have to find it. So where is it located? Are there public hearings held? And again, those public hearings from parents that I've talked to around the country, those are going on now. Yeah. So that's something you really want to hop on. Then once you get the basic overview of where do I find the budget, familiarize yourself a little bit. It's amazing how when you go back and you look at something repeatedly, it does start to make sense. The first time in, do not be frustrated. It's quite overwhelming. But the more you look at something, the more okay, this is what they mean by that, right? So give yourself some time and be patient with yourself when you look at these. So that's kind of the overarching how to get yourself up to speed in general about budgetary issues. Then drill down into more specific ESSER/COVID relief funds and where that money went. Most school districts have that information on their website. So you can search on your school's website, district's website for ESSER, and many times, not all, but many times that information is readily available and they put it out there. You want to find out who controls how that money is spent. Typically it's the school board. Even if you have a superintendent, in many cases, the superintendent works for the school board. So it's the school board who's the superintendent advises, but the school board votes on it. So you want to check on that. And again, if you've done your due diligence getting up to this point and you found who's my school board member, right? Reach out to your school board member if you don't know. Never be embarrassed to ask questions and to have things explained to you, because that's the quickest way to learn things. And then what is the district's plan to address extended funding once the ESSER funds are depleted? As Erika touched on, what are they going to do about all the staff that they hired during the time they were essentially flush with all of this COVID money? Another thing that I found when I was starting to look over some of this stuff, I started to look into my local district. And one thing I found that was really interesting to keep an eye on as you're looking at these budgets is there's an advertised budget, which is a draft, if you will. There's the adopted budget, which has been voted on, right? And so the school board has adopted the budget. And then there's a revised budget where sometimes they'll come in and, go clean up on aisle 6 and they'll sort everything out, right? So in a local district, Fairfax County Public Schools, for example, their 2024 adopted budget for legal fees was $1.9 million. So $2 million on legal fees. That seems pretty significant. But then when you look at their revised budget, it's $7.9 million. So you can see how much, I just give that as an example to see how much something can change from an advertised, adopted, revised budget. They're kind of 3 different cycles. So you really want to keep an eye on that. And a good way to do that is if you look at those 3 steps from the prior year, and you can see if there are any main categories where the money has significantly shifted. And then if you see a trend like that happening in your district where they're really under budgeting in certain areas, it might be, in the DEI area, it might be in the SEL area, it might be in the retention area or the pension area or the new hires or, staff area. So you might see some major shifts in certain specific budgets from what they're putting out to what they're sweeping in kind of on, when nobody's really paying as much attention. So if you saw that from last year, that's a good thing to keep in mind for this year. And that's a good thing to ask when you're having these discussions with, whomever it is at your district along the road in this process is, oh, I noticed last year your whatever category went from this, and then it went up to this, and then it went up to this. And this year you're budgeting at the low end again at this phase of the process. So what happened last year, and should we anticipate that's going to happen this year? So they're just, just to make it more complicated, right? There are these different stages that the budget goes through. So the earlier you can get involved and the earlier you can ask your questions, it's amazing because some of these officials will, bring your issue back to their committee, right? So it's good to get your voice heard. And if you can't make heads or tails of anything that you're looking at and it's just totally confusing to you and it's totally frustrating to you, or you're seeing something that doesn't really seem to make sense, you can always send it to us at Parents Defending Education and we can look at things for you and we can give you our recommendations on how to proceed, types of other more specific questions that you might want to ask your district. So we're always here to help you with that. We understand it's a daunting process, but you should give yourselves a pat on the back because you're doing the first thing, which is opening your eyes to what's happening. And then you can just follow all these other steps that come after. Use our website, use the resources that we have, and certainly reach out to us. And we're here to help you in any way that we can, understanding this fiscal cliff and the impact that it's going to have on your district.
Thank you, Marissa. And yes, send all your questions to Marissa. She is our queen. a couple things I just thought of while you were talking that we didn't really highlight in the video, but I think that not that they didn't highlight in the video that we haven't mentioned yet is the two things. One is you may have noticed that Marguerite Rosa talked about higher poverty districts and higher need districts are going to experience a steeper fiscal cliff. They're going to have more cuts that they're dealing with. And that is because they got so much more money in these relief funds,
Right.
or COVID funds. That means that now they're going to be adjusting to a much bigger loss of dollars. So again, their pain point is going to be very significant. Again, not unexpected, and it is logical. It makes sense, but it's still going to mean that that's going to be, they're going to be having to make right sizing their budgets is going to be harder than it's going to be in some other places.
Right. The more you got, the harder the cuts are gonna hit.
Yeah. And so when you see in headlines, that these evil people are making more cuts in high need districts than other districts, it's not that a decision was made, oh, you know what, we want to be really tough on the higher poverty district, or we want to, make the people in the high need district suffer more. No, it's just quite literally, you got more, so you're losing more, which means that your adjustment is going to be harder. I had another thought, but now the other thing I guess I just would say too is that you really don't want to feel blindsided. That's part of why we're doing this now. We know that there's still so much sort of, whether it's frustration, resentment, anger, feelings of like PTSD over what happened during COVID in the schools, is that we know that if parents who are already totally frustrated about schools finally feel like things are getting back to normal, and then at the last second they find out, that their district announces, we're cutting all sports, or we're cutting our entire arts program.
Right.
That is going to cause like huge, what's the word I'm looking for? Outcry and outrage within districts. I mean, I've seen it happen before, way before COVID was a thing. Even I've seen this happen before, where there's certain issues that really, really get parents upset. And so be ready so that you aren't completely blindsided when you suddenly get a text from your friend that tells you, did you hear? They're not going to have, the baseball team next year.
Right. And going along with that, one thing I did want to mention was, we're focused on looking at your school budget and talking to your school officials. But what we're starting to see in districts is, as the districts realize as well that this ESSER money is drying up, they're shifting their asks and their funding requests to the counties. Right. So then some counties are proposing tax increases. Yes. Because they want to, quote, close the gap of funding, the emergency funding, really, which you really don't, shouldn't really have a gap for if it was emergency funding. But the way that some localities are handling that is they're going back to the well of the taxpayer. So that's why this is a big concern, and how the school districts handle this money drying up is a big concern to people across the community, whether you have kids in school or not. Because sometimes people think that these school related issues, oh, I don't have kids in school, so I don't care about that. But we know all these school related issues have an impact on your house, the housing market in your area. It has an impact on your property assessment, which is directly tied to your how much tax you're going to pay. So, I would say too, I would just advise people that, don't turn a blind eye to this topic just because you don't have kids in school. If you're grandparents and your all of your value is in your home for when you retire, right? And that's your life savings, and the taxes are going up, and there are other adjustments happening in your district wide to help cover some of these losses on the school district, for the school district funding, it is going to impact you, because they are trying to find money other places. And one of the main places they like to find money is by raising property taxes.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, I think that there was this naive belief that, oh, the federal government, they're not really going to turn off this money. They're not really going to end it. They're not going to leave us high and dry. And because again, districts are not used to having less in a year than they had before.
Right.
And so the federal government's not going to do that. Thank God. So now many are looking to, Marissa lives in a place where it's countywide. I live in a place where they just go to the town government. And so, yeah, that is going to be something, I think, where there's going to be efforts to try to mitigate these reductions by increasing revenue. And one way they're going to try to do that is going to be with tax raises. And by the way, like, it could be that you agree with that strategy, or disagree with that strategy, but either way, you want to sort of know, how did we get here and why are they asking for this? I mean, that's the other thing, right? If you're going to vote on something, or if your representative's going to vote on something, you want to know sort of what's the deal and how did we get here? And what does a vote yay or nay mean for me and for my community? Anything else, Marissa, before we wrap up?
No, I just wanted to say, as you just stated, it's really about transparency. No matter what side of this you fall on, whether you are okay with, raising taxes to keep all programs that schools have and keep the same level of funding, even if the enrollment numbers are dropping, or you don't agree with that, no matter where you fall on that spectrum, the most important thing is we all want to be good consumers and we all want transparency. And being a good consumer of what's going on in your school district is an important thing that we all want to do. So we need the transparency piece, and sometimes to fill that transparency piece, if it's not readily available, which it's never completely readily available,
Correct.
We have to educate ourselves, we have to ask questions, and we have to get involved in the process.
And it's especially important because this COVID relief money was given to school districts with no strings attached. They didn't have to spend it on certain things. So that's why the transparency piece is, I mean, it's always important, but it's kind of extra important when it was like a free for all. And so now you at least want to know, what did they spend it on? How much have they spent? How much do they have left, etc. Well, our call to action for all of you is to share this conversation with other parents or other people that you know, or grandparents, or again, anybody that you think would be interested in this. And the reality is pretty much everybody, again, no one needs to become an ESSER expert, but everybody, I think, does need to get to a place now where they know that when they hear ESSER money or fiscal cliff, they have a sense of what we're talking about. And what we're talking about is a massive infusion of money into school districts for 2 years, emergency money, it's going to be shut off. It's not going to keep flowing, right? It's coming to an end. It's not a surprise. So it is abrupt, but it's expected. And now districts are going through, again, that really difficult process. And it just makes sense for everybody to know, like Marissa says, right? Like, you're a consumer. And so understand what's going on. I'm trying to think of what else I wanted to say. So again, this is going to really wrap up in May and June. So again, start asking now. You do not want to hear, at the end of the year, that the program that's most important to you or your family is gone. You do not want to hear that, the best reading teacher in the district, the one who's able to teach anybody how to read, that they've lost their job. So again, get informed now. And again, reach out to us if you have any questions. Marissa would be happy to help. No, I'm just kidding. We're all very happy to help you. And again, thank you to Marissa for joining us. And a huge thank you to the team at Georgetown University and their Edunomics lab, and Marguerite Rosa, who, again, we wouldn't really even understand this if it wasn't for the work that they've been doing. And they are trying to get this information out to everybody. So anything you can do to help, share these graphs, share the slides. I assume we're going to post them somewhere. And now that I've said that we will. And with that, again, thanks for joining us, and we will talk to you soon.
Thank you.